Good morning. Could I ask everyone to take their seats, please? Grab some breakfast and take your seats.
How are you, darling? I heard.
Just gonna grab a coffee.
Claro, claro, y hay unas empanadas, esto es latinizante, así que... Where's Jason today? Good morning, everybody. I hope you're settled. There's some Latin breakfast in the back. I'm Peter Schechter, and I'm the director of the Adrian Arch Latin America Center, and that's why there's a Latin American breakfast in the back. We like to keep our breakfasts in our region. Thank you so much for coming this morning. I'm joined by a number of colleagues here from the Atlantic Council. Rachel De Leviori, Assistant Director to our center on my left. Jason Marzak is seated over there. The Deputy Director, Peter Engelke, on my left is the Senior Fellow to the Strategic Foresight Initiative. Indeed, this project brought together a number of people from the Atlantic Council and a number of centers to work together. I just want to begin by thanking all of you for coming, and I just want to recognize a few people who've been particularly helpful to this project along the way. Connie McCormick, thank you for coming and braving. I understand you had a sort of tough flight out here for coming from California. Francisco Guerrero, muchas gracias. Thank you for coming. Secretary for Strengthening Democracy at the OAS. Bill Sweeney, on my left, the president of IFES, Paul de Gregorio, the former commissioner of the EAC and elections expert, Matt Masterson, a commissioner on the EAC, and of course, I want to in particular thank the funders for this project, Smartmatic. We're joined today by Antonio Mujica, on my right, CEO, and Mark Malloch Brown, the chairman of Smartmatic, and many of you also know Mark from his life as the Deputy Secretary General at the UN and the former administrator of the United Nations Development Program. So today we are really looking forward to engage all of you in a discussion. You were each invited here because you're all important stakeholders in the field of elections. So we want to know what you think. We want to hear from you. And even though this event was invite only, I just want to be clear that the event is being live streamed, and so it is on the record, and so everything you say here is going to be for attribution. So here is what the agenda that we have in store for you this morning. I'm going to give a very brief overview of this project and the background for this project. Connie will then talk a little bit about her paper, and then Rachel and I will co-moderate this morning's session, and we're going to make an effort to include as many of you, and those who don't talk will ask to talk, throughout for the rest of the morning. So let me just quickly talk about what this project is about. So we all know that we can book a hotel, call a cab, order dinner through an app on our phone, and we can even engage in parts of our civic duty online. Last week I filed my taxes online. But when it comes to voting, there seems to be a bit of a disconnect. Certain pieces of electronic Certain pieces of voting are electronic. You check in at polling stations with electronic poll books. Registration is online. My daughter turned 18 and she registered online. These are all pretty widely accepted practices. But when it comes to casting a ballot and counting those ballots, technology remains elusive. And it's clear that this is not going to last. We see the advent of technology in components of elections as being inevitable. Like it, hate it, have doubts about it, technology is coming. And so I think we have a very rare opportunity here this morning to do something which we don't often get to do, which is to get in front and discuss and be proactive about a disruptive force. And that's what makes the initiative that the Atlantic Council has been doing for the last year or so both urgent and exciting. And so we landed on the question, which is how can we implement electronic voting in a way that increases transparency, access, and legitimacy? How can technology be a means to an end, the end being stronger democracies? So we involved people from across industries and across the country to help us try to get some answers. We began a year ago with in-depth interviews of a plethora of civil society, election, and technology leaders. We did an event at Stanford with President Toomas Ilves of Estonia, the only country in the world to allow citizens to vote online, and we had the event moderated by Frank Fukuyama. We had a dinner in Silicon Valley with 25 Silicon Valley executives to dive into the issue of user trust. Why are people willing to share every moment of their lives on Facebook or Twitter, give their home addresses to Lyft and Uber? Vote, however, voting on an online platform seems to be a long way off. And so we heard from Intel and Hewlett-Packard and Salesforce as well as from election officials from Los Angeles County. And right here in DC, we had an event with former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, which started with a discussion of what makes for strong democracies around the world, with or without technology. And some of the other participants in that event are here today. In particular, I want to thank Pat Merlot for having supported this all the way through. Bill, Mark, Matt have all been very, very supportive, and we're really glad that you're back here today. And then Connie McCormick, herself an elections expert, compiled the research and the paper that you have before you. And so that's where I'd like to start off and pass it over to Rachel to lead a Q&A with Connie that is going to try to tease out very quickly. We've given you the homework assignment to read it, but we also want to hear Connie's conclusions. And so we want to tease out very quickly what are the headlines of the issues that we want to discuss today. So I'll turn it over to Rachel and be back with you in 10 or 15 minutes.
Great. Thanks so much, Peter. I just want to reiterate Peter's appreciation for all of you joining us this morning. Looking around the room, I think it's pretty clear we'll have a robust conversation about the paper and about some of the questions that we pose in this project. As many of you know, Connie McCormick was the registrar for LA County, is an international elections expert, most recently led the OSCE election observation mission in the UK last May, and now she can add to her resume Atlantic Council author. So Connie, thank you very much for taking the time to trek out here. So even though everyone did have some homework, which was to read the paper in advance of today, why don't you give us a really quick overview of sort of the international approach that we took to us, and then we'll get into some of the more specific points that you hit.
Thanks, Rachel and Peter. I will just spend a couple of minutes doing that. What I was happy about with this paper is that it provides a global perspective on the use and the promise of technology in elections. And it really opens up our vision. I think we've sometimes been a little myopic, and it kind of opens up our vision to look at the whole world and the experiences around the world with election technology. Not just the good, but also the bad and the negatives and the positives and what we can learn from that. And you know, by looking around the world, it really reveals something that at the last Atlantic County Council convening in October, Bill Sweeney said very succinctly that in this arena, the U.S. really does lag. They're not the leading indicator, we're the lagging indicator. And, you know, we all know about elections and how volatile and emotional they are. Their very nature, they're volatile and emotional. And why would we wonder that that emotion bleeds into the technology and the voting equipment that we use? It's really not a surprise. It really highlights the importance of evidence-based decision-making in a collaborative environment with a full range of stakeholders so that we can build partnerships, you know, foster dialogue, and try to enhance that credibility and trust. We've lost a lot of trust. And in the U.S., if we look back now, there was so much angst and distrust after the 2000 election. This really sort of began it. The public really learned for the first time not only that we were using some really flawed old voting equipment, but the public also learned that our voting system and people can actually vote. 500,000 people could vote more votes nationwide, but not win the election. And this created an environment of significant mistrust. And so now that it's that election 16 years in our rearview mirror, I really think it's a good time for all of us now in this arena to stand back and reboot the conversation, because the world has changed. I mean, we're not in the same world we were in then. We're out of sync. The election process is really out of sync with the world and the modern world today. The pervasive technology that is in every aspect of our life. And it's becoming more and more obvious how out of sync that really is. And voters are very tech savvy, and they're multi-generationally tech savvy. The needs of the multi-generational voter is everything from aging voters have needs, disabled voters have needs, accessibility issues. Young people, their lives are really pretty much defined by the digital world. And what about overseas and military voters? I mean, they really, really can get more access and more opportunity to cast a timely vote with technology. So those are some of the issues we've all been grappling with. I think it was for me, very interesting to look around the world and see what everyone is doing. And I think that was the most important learning experience for me, that we really need to kickstart this process and involve more funding, more people, and more ability to do a better job. So I'll turn it back to you, Rachel.
Great. Well, I'm gonna throw it right back to you and say, sort of in looking around the world, what would you say? Sort of walk us through the top benefits that you found could be associated with electronic voting.
Well, I think the paper tries to outline that we all believe the importance. We have to have secure, accurate, reliable election systems. I mean, everyone agrees to that. The disagreement is how we get there and how we make that happen. And I think if we start looking at evidence and the whole process, we see that, and if you look at, again, the 2000 election, the key issue was accuracy. I mean, accuracy really matters in elections. And I've done a lot of recounts. I've been involved in a lot of recounts. And it becomes very disturbing, not just to the candidates, but the general public, when there's a recognition that the recount doesn't come out exactly the same as the initial count. And it really never does. There are so many other factors. There's mistakes that are made. And the review of people that have adopted and governments that have chosen a more modern electronic system has been proven that there's more accuracy. You don't have as much errors. I mean, the errors can be as much as 3 to 7% of the vote. That's been documented in elections, that whether it's undervoting unintentionally, whether it's overvoting, whether it's marking outside of a box, whether it's just tired people counting ballots. Inaccuracy is a huge problem, which often comes up. So that's an issue.
I know that speed was something that we talked about as well.
And speed, yeah. I think when we see Brazil and how they were able to have a nationwide election last year and have the results in 2 hours, it's sort of astounding to think that...
This is a country of 114 million voters.
Exactly, 114 million voters. So the ability is out there. The processes are out there, and some countries have taken advantage of them. But then we have to look at the obstacles, and those are both real and perceived, I think, the obstacles to moving into a more technological realm here.
And what would you say those principal obstacles are?
Well, I think really the report identifies that security is always the number one, and in a world where we hear about security breaches every day in our lives, this is a understandable and a reasonable concern. And more research needs to be done in this area, more work. It really hasn't been funded at all. And then the other issue is that no one really knows what it costs. I mean, we heard at our last event from the representative of the UN that the countries are clamoring for assistance from the UN to help modernize their voting and election processes. But they don't have any comprehensive or reliable analysis of what that cost would be. And not just the cost of the obvious costs that are upfront and maintenance, but the cost avoidance issues. No one's really taken a study of that. What is avoided with all and environmental considerations with a lot of paper? That really hasn't been analyzed. Well, we have some very intelligent people in this room who are very knowledgeable and have a great track record on evaluating these types of processes, and indeed have done some components of this in the past. We have IFAS, we have DI, we have NDI, we have International IDEA. There are quite a few organizations with the experience and the knowledge to do that, but of course they need some funding to help them put together the type of robust study and research that is really needed to be credible. And it would be very good if bodies such as the OAS and UNDP got involved so that this could be more of a worldwide.
I'm sure everyone is so happy that they came here today to get assigned a massive research project and grants. And so something else that you talked about in the paper is the importance of independent electoral bodies. And what role do you see them playing in helping to sort of mitigate the bad, accentuate the benefits of electronic voting?
I think that's another thing that opens up our minds to this whole process, that looking around the world, the bodies that actually conduct elections or are responsible, whether nationwide or even more local, it's so important that they be autonomous, that they be independent, that they be free from a lot of political influences. There's examples in the papers that are some that are not, and there's examples of some that are. And the credibility and the ability to do the research and to get the funding needed to study and then implement new voting technology is critical to have a credible, believable electoral body. It really stands out as one of the most important factors.
Great. Well, it was really helpful. I think that's sort of the greatest hits of the paper, and now we'll sort of turn it back over to Peter to start a conversation about what you all think of this.
Great. So let's begin the discussion. Let me put some moderators' rules down, and I'm going to take the prerogative to call on some people. But I'd like to ask each of those people this. I want this to be a conversation, so if everybody can keep remarks to around 2 minutes, that would be fantastic. If somebody then wants to speak, I would ask you to turn your nameplate, not upside down, but vertically. If you want to make a very quick point about something that the previous speaker has said, raise your hand and I'll keep track, but then you have to keep that very quick point to really a very quick point of 20 seconds or so. And we will go down and keep track of names and call on you. And so what I propose to do is to backtrack a bit and take Connie's opportunities and obstacles, and I'm sure you all have opinions about these, and we can run through the ones that we've identified, and I want you to feel all free to join in. Bill, I'm going to start with you and put you on the spot. And I mean, Connie mentioned speed as really one of the sort of most important things that technology brings, that the speed of vote count is very important for voter confidence, particularly in new democracies. People are more likely to believe the result, and that the result was real, not tampered with, if it's announced with relative speed. Can you walk us through a bit your experience with that and how it interrelates with what technology can add to this?
Do I have to follow the 2-minute rule? Kidding. First First, let me say thank you, Peter, Rachel, Connie, and our colleagues at Smartmatic for jump-starting this debate. To go to the specific point on speed, at IFAS we have worked very closely with election commissions to develop a process so that as results come in from any polling station or precinct or ward, however they develop it, that goes into a live feed into a spot at the Central Election Commission, which is accessible to all the news media, so that they can have simultaneous live feeds of the data as it is being reported through the system. This has been very, very successful in some places. In Guatemala, I think in last year it was key to keeping peace in the first round, as well as giving the country certainty about the outcome of the second round. In Kenya, it didn't work so well. It had a bunch of interruptions and problems, some technological, some political, which eroded a bit of the confidence. However, Kenyans were still getting data all the way through, so what we were most afraid of in Kenya, namely a repeat of the disastrous situation in the prior election, did not happen. Kenya did not burn. Plenty of aggravation and lessons learned as a result, which we at IFAS have been able to apply in a number of other elections. My bias is pro-technology. But my concern is in this space, and I'm almost finished with 2 minutes, that technology decisions are oftentimes almost innocent bystanders in drive-by shootings. Sometimes it's the political process, which makes decisions based on trying to achieve a goal of excluding and discriminating against certain populations. Sometimes it's a very flawed procurement process, which then in political cultures that are not mature and are used to corruption in the procurement process have yet another example to highlight of a flawed procurement process, which goes then directly to the trust in the outcome. Sometimes it's a lack of voter education as well as poll worker education. We've seen this where poll workers are so focused on getting the machine right that they ignore the other issues. They haven't had time to absorb that, or voters have not been communicated fully with, so they don't follow the steps and thus get excluded from the process. So there's an education element to this, and that goes to the fourth element, and that's called time. And oftentimes we see technology decisions made, particularly in democracies in transition, very late in the process. And that's because the political process oftentimes thinks the silver bullet is a technology, not working through the elements of time that it takes to build a robust technological infrastructure. So briefly, those are the challenges, but I'll just duck from here on out, okay?
Kevin, let me just ask you the OAS's experiences. You were until recently at the OAS. I mean, the OAS's experience in terms of looking at elections, monitoring elections, and how important is speed in terms of credibility in your work in Latin America?
Well, thank you very much. And I would like to say that I'm very glad that you guys are doing this, and I commend the Atlantic Council for tackling this issue, which is an issue that I came across time and again when I was at the OAS. I mean, generally speaking, the speed is very important, but it really depends on the political context. And this is a general point, and I think Bill was spot on in saying that before we think of throwing technology into the electoral process, we really have to look at the fundamentals, and sometimes the fundamentals are just not there. I mean, ultimately, the pillar upon which the electoral process is built is trust. And if trust is not there, no matter how much technology you throw at it, you won't make things better. Arguably, you will make it worse. And it's trust in two different ways. I mean, trust on the election management body. If that is not there, it's introducing technology into the process will probably not get us very far. And trust in the process whereby technology is introduced. I mean, it has to be done with transparency. It has to be done in a way that keeps the stakeholders involved, that keep the political parties, that keep the civil society involved, because otherwise it will just make, it can make a complicated situation even worse. And I would only add that one of the things that I came across time and again, in dealing with different countries in Latin America that were thinking of introducing electronic voting technology, is that there's this notion, precisely because it's so tied up with the fundamentals of the political system, with the levels of trust in the electoral process, there's this mistaken notion that introducing technology into elections is like instant coffee. I mean, it's something you do overnight, and it will give you, results overnight. And that's just not the case. I mean, this is very complicated stuff, and you have to do it gradually. You have to do it in a way that keeps stakeholders involved. You have to do it in a very deliberate way. And if you guys, can help educate election management bodies and the people that are thinking of doing these things, that that this is something that has to be done in a mindful way, that would be a great service.
Jim Dixon has his card up, and I know that access is another benefit that we saw. The capabilities of electronic voting expanded access to various parts of the electorate, whether through ballots in various languages or through using sound systems for the visually impaired. Jim, would you jump in here in our conversation?
Yes. I clearly, I am a strong supporter of electronic voting. I wanted to speak to the speed question. Electronic voting helps with speed not only on the counting end, but on the voting end. There's clearly a need for more study, but I know of two small studies where they timed how long it took to vote a ballot with paper and pen and how long it took to vote on a tablet, and the tablet was significantly faster. This is important for all voters. It means shorter lines. For voters with disabilities, speed is also important. Depending on the individual's disability and the length of the ballot, it can take a long time, much longer, for a person with a disability to vote. And there's good technology that helps this, and there's bad technology that helps this. There's a machine which is worthless, that is very popular in the United States, and which is slow as molasses. California has long ballots on this lousy piece of equipment, which shall go unnamed. It's called the Automark. People who voted a full California ballot took 45 minutes. So there's not all technology is speedy, but most of it will be and should be.
Thank you. Well, we have you. Would you like to talk a little bit about access and how important that is?
Yes, access is extremely important. I'm blind. because of the 2000 election mess, I voted for the first time secretly in 2004. Prior to that, my wife marked my ballot. We were in the voting booth here in D.C., and Renee said, "Jim, I know you love me. Now I know you trust me because you think I'm marking this ballot for that idiot." Technology gives privacy, something that most able-bodied people take for granted. But it's not just important for people with visual issues, for people with manual problems. I've looked at lots of these, what look like confusing, sloppy, messed up paper ballots. And if you think about that from a disability perspective, the lines are outside the oval, in and out. Well, imagine yourself with Parkinson's disease and you're trying to fill in an oval. For people with many learning disabilities, which is a population much larger than blind and low vision, paper is associated with failure, with problems in school. There are also specific technical problems with being able to look across the page from the candidate's name to the right oval. And not everybody can track across a piece of paper where there's an open space between the name and the oval you want. For people who are paralyzed, there are paddles that can be used with machines so that, and other high-tech devices, so that Stephen Hawking, for instance, could vote a secret ballot with equipment. There's no way he could vote a secret ballot with paper.
Thank you. Ruben Perina, you've been an observer in many elections. Welcome.
Yes, thank you, Peter.
Would you press your mic?
Thanks, Peter. Thanks for the invitation, Peter, and the Atlantic Council. I just wanted to sort of support and validate what Kevin mentioned or just talked about a little bit. Just for the purpose of opening up the discussion, I wanted to sort of challenge the centrality of voting technology. Although the introduction of voting technology certainly goes a long way to improve electoral integrity, but electoral integrity, credibility, and ultimately the legitimacy of an electoral process could be certainly damaged by a number of factors, including, for example, the lack of autonomy of the electoral authority, irregularities in electoral organization and electoral the electoral registry, or even the electoral code or the electoral regulations. It could be damaged by the incumbents' abuse of the state resources that make the elections unfair. The lack of electoral observation, international electoral could also damage the the integrity and quality of the election. So these are factors I think that one needs to take into account as one proceeds to think about introducing electoral the voting technology. Countries like Costa Rica, where Kevin is from, or Uruguay, there are models of democracy and elections, do not use basically any technology, are very manual, and nobody questions the integrity and nobody questions the credibility or legitimacy of the process. So I just wanted to make those brief comments, Peter. Thanks.
Thank you. Francisco Guerrero.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I want to say that I'm extremely happy to have had the opportunity of checking this paper. I thank Connie McCormack for the good work. And I would like to say that in page 17, when you see the recommendations, there's one that for me is essential, and I would like to discuss just a few things about it. In this recommendation, it says that international guidelines are needed to foster system legitimacy. And I would like to say that, as it has been already mentioned, confidence and lack of trust is a very important issue, particularly in Latin America. As Ruben said, the use of technology can be important, but it's not the main factor in order to get confidence. In that sense, I would like to put forward the possibility of the OAS with Atlantic Council and with other stakeholders to work towards the possibility of developing this recommendation. I think that particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean, of course, we have to work harder in order to get more technical cooperation with these kind of technologies that are related to democracy. And in that sense, I would like to mention very briefly 5 points that, according to my point of view, could be useful in this discussion. First of all, to take advantage of the electoral missions that we're already carrying out. I think the information that we get from these elections, and Ruben knows that very well because he has been an observer, I think this kind of information could be very useful in order to establish these guidelines. Also to say that an increased number of organizations have committed to the importance and benefits of adhering to standards and good practices. I think the cases in which you have good practices using technology can be very useful, but also in cases where technology has been abused. I'm just referring, for example, to the last example in Mexico. I'm from Mexico City. I used to be an electoral counselor back in my country, and what happened in Chiapas in the last local election, it was a big scandal because somebody maneuvered this technology in order to commit fraud. So we also have to be very careful in this kind of cases. In that sense, just to finish, I would say that the OAS, as a neutral third party, can contribute to the improvement of quality in election services through the implementation of new technologies, and also helping the electoral bodies in order to gain confidence from the public. I guess that the main factor in Latin America regarding the use of technology goes to the fact of the lack of confidence, and the lack of confidence is always a problem that we're facing. So I think a good reflection would have to be carried out in that sense.
Thank you. Paul de Gregorio.
Peter, thank you. And thank you to the Atlantic Council for bringing us all together. I know about 90% of the folks in this room, and there's some, as Connie said, there's some real brain power in this room when it comes to the field of elections. And Connie, thank you for this great paper. I'm not surprised. You know, it's a terrific paper. Connie and I worked together in Moscow in 1995 and go way back on things. You know, this year in the United States, we're seeing elections every week, and they're still hotly contested. But in February, we saw long lines in New Hampshire. Just last week in Arizona, we saw people waiting 5 hours to vote. I mean, you know, that's just crazy. This past Sunday on Easter, my 19-month-old grandson was sitting next to me. I had my phone here. He grabbed it. He turned it. He went like this and this and this, found the app, the game app that I had loaded on there, and he just started playing with my phone. He's 19 months old. And here we are in a situation in this country and throughout the world where we take a step forward in technology and a step back. I'm a promoter of technology like Jim Dixon, who I've known for a long time. I believe in it. But we have caucuses that limit participation for people with disabilities and people overseas because they have to show up at a certain place, and there's no effort for them to participate in many states. We take a step forward with electronic poll books, with the use of social media to get participation up and to promote it, and it's good. But we take a step back when states move towards paper, move towards voting by mail, and making it more difficult for people with disabilities to cast their ballots, especially long ballots, as Jim Dixon mentioned. I was in India 3 weeks ago, and the Commissioner of Elections told me that his parliament had passed a law against his best wishes to move back to a paper trail on their electronic voting device that they've used for many years very successfully. And he was lamenting the fact that it's going to cost 20,000 hectares of trees every time they have an election in India. So that's a step back. But I want to ask Antonio about his recent success in Utah. County has a whole page here on internet voting. And Utah had its caucuses last week, and great participation. There were caucuses, though, that can limit participation by people with disabilities and people abroad. But I read that about 25,000 people voted online very successfully, and people from all over the world who, if this was not in place, would not have been able to participate in this democratic process in their state. So I'd like to ask Antonio if you can just give us a little more detail about that and how it went, because I know Smartmatic was involved in it.
Great. Thank you, Paul, and well, thank you, everybody. I'm actually extremely happy and excited to be around so many people that really care about elections, which doesn't happen to me a lot. And the reason Smartmatic has worked so hard on bringing technology to elections is because we really have the same worries you have, and we're trying to solve them. That's the only reason to introduce technologies, is to make them better. So again, thank you very much, everybody, for being part of this. Utah was fantastic. I mean, I think it was an outright success. 90% of the people that registered to vote online actually went and voted online. We ran a survey right after. As you know, this is very easy to do on an online system. 75% of the voters that voted online participated on the survey. Of those, 94% said the process was very simple and they really liked it. 97% said they wanted to vote again online. And 82% said they wanted to see this implemented nationwide. We had about 25% of the people voted were Utahns that voted from outside of Utah, but from inside the United States. And there was a much smaller percentage that voted from all around the world. And as you said, from around 50 countries, even from French Polynesia, very exotic, far-off countries, they participated in the Utah caucus online. So I think the experience all over was great. Shamefully, we got a couple of bad headlines with problems with registration, which is kind of funny because in reality what did happen there was that a lot of people wanted to vote online, but they hadn't registered to vote online, so they were very disappointed that they couldn't do it. And that was 85% of the calls made to the support center. So it had nothing to do with, any problem. It's just they failed to register, right? But that, got us a couple of bad headlines. So I think, I think this is, we're never advocating to move voting online. I absolutely believe, and after talking to politicians in every corner of the world, that elections and poll stations are here to stay, and the kind of holiday of democracy of going to the poll station, going to the town square will stay and has to stay. Is part of the culture. But I do believe that online voting has a place in the whole equation. Initially to supplement other forms of remote voting that are very flawed and definitely do not work, like postal voting and all the different ways of overseas and absentee voting. And secondly, to provide an alternative channel like we just did in Utah for, again, 20% of the people prefer to vote online than having to go to a poll station. So that's I think the future around the world. Sorry if I took too long.
No, thank you, Antonio. I think Antonio makes a point about in the online discussion about how that enhances participation. And Aaron, can I put you on the spot and talk about young people and how do you make sure that young people remain constantly involved? What is the role for what is Facebook's experience as both a technology company but also as a civil society instrument to bring in young people?
Sure. Well, thank you again for the opportunity to be here. And it's not just the young. We have over 1.5 billion people on Facebook around the world,
Right,
and
right.
they are absolutely using the platform to engage in the political process. In the United States, for example, 4 out of 10 people on Facebook have been engaging on the U.S. election. Actually, in 2015, the U.S. election was the most talked about issue on Facebook. So people are on Facebook. They're engaging. I think technology provides an opportunity for us to continue that engagement in the voting process, something that we do also on Facebook, as folks may have seen. We have a voter registration button where people can indicate that they voted. We think that's an opportunity for them to be telling their friends, to encourage them to go out to say they voted. This year, something we also did in the primaries is about a week before each state's voter registration deadline, we educated people about a way where they could go to register to vote. Again, to encourage people to be going to the polls to register and to vote. And so I think the more that we can use technology in this way to engage people in the political process, hopefully that will help build the trust that I know so many folks have talked about here when it comes to actually rendering a vote. And I think perhaps, dare I say, technology provides an opportunity to build trust, because as folks have talked about with paper, there's lots of issues that we identify here, and technology can be seen as a way to address many of those concerns. And certainly we have a lot of experience in educating people about the role of technology, the role of security, surveying people about what are their concerns, where are they focused, focusing education on those concerns, third-party audits, those types of issues. All of those, I think, processes can help build trust. So Facebook's happy to be here, happy to continue to engage with all of these experts on this important issue. So thanks.
Larry, thanks for coming back.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Yeah. First of all, I just wanted to congratulate Connie. This is a very detailed and far-reaching report, and having written a few kinds of reports like this, I know how much work goes into them. So congratulations on putting it together. I just had a couple of comments that I thought maybe a little bit controversial, but maybe helpful for the conversation. One is I'd like one thing that I think that has been missing a little bit from this conversation is what we mean by electronic voting, and what the definition of that is. There's a little bit of if a system has paper, it's not electronic voting. If it doesn't, then it is electronic voting. And to my mind, that's not really the right distinction to draw. And in fact, if we're talking about, for instance, and Connie mentions the Maryland system in her report, to me, that's an electronic voting system. It has, all of the potential drawbacks and benefits that we might identify when we're talking about electronic voting in terms of both, increasing accuracy and speed, and also kind of the drawbacks that go with moving to a system that's, that counts by using software that is dependent on hardware that, in the United States, where we're confronting issues which may no longer be manufactured, that can fail, and all of the other things that we're dealing with now with aging equipment. So I do think that in kind of discussing the benefits and drawbacks of electronic voting, a clear definition about what we're talking about would be very helpful. And another thing we haven't quite gotten into yet, but I thought was a really interesting recommendation that Connie made, was around financial analysis of the cost of electronic voting. I'll say I'm a little bit skeptical of doing this because the Brennan Center tried to do this several years ago and failed in looking at the costs of moving to electronic voting in the United States. And because jurisdictions are so different and have such different needs, just even within the United States, of course, this is true. What moving to one particular system or another might cost is very difficult to say in a general way. So while I do think that this kind of analysis would be very helpful, I think it might be more helpful to think about it in terms of what kind of factors should jurisdictions consider when they're thinking about costs. Because one of the things we found in the United States was when election officials were purchasing equipment, they didn't necessarily think out all of the costs that were associated with moving to one particular technology or another.
Thank you. I just wonder if I can, Saeed, would you indulge me? Let me ask Matt I mean, on the issue of you brought up a number of issues and particularly this last one that you discussed, which is the issue of how hard it is to figure out cost. I mean, Matt, you're from Ohio, so if somebody comes to you and says, in your home state of Ohio, should we do a paper election or should we do an electronic election? How have you found? How does one figure out the cost of that?
Yeah,
that is clearly one of the main obstacles.
Absolutely, and thank you for the question, for allowing me to be here and participate. Matt Masterson with the Election Assistance Commission here in the United States. And not surprisingly, the answer to that isn't that simple, and I'm actually glad you used my home state of Ohio as an example, because it may be the perfect example. There are 6 different voting systems used in Ohio, with actually a larger variety of election management systems tacked onto that, and so it's actually exponentially larger than that when you look at versioning and whatnot, because the counties get to choose, and the counties choose based on what they think is best for their voters within the state of Ohio. In other states like Georgia, it's statewide system, statewide electronic touchscreen voting machines. And so, as was mentioned in Connie's report, what fits within a certain jurisdiction in America doesn't fit for others. And so the challenge is determining the costs within the parameters of the type of voting system. And when I say system, I don't mean just the technology, but in fact what you're administering as a system. So in Ohio, we have early voting in person, we have vote by mail, and we have polling place voting, all offered over the course of 29 days. And so the type of voting system needed to support that isn't just one monolithic system, but in fact a variety of pieces of technology to allow to support that. And so the costs for that are very different than the costs, for instance, in Oregon, where it's almost primarily vote by mail. And how to serve that. And so the answer is, this is exactly what counties and states are struggling with right now. But I actually view it, I tend to be an optimist, I view it as an opportunity. When HAVA was passed, and Connie mentions this very well in the report, when HAVA was passed, counties and states scrambled to take the money and roll out systems in time for the deadline, instead of being able to take a kind of methodical approach to how best to address the needs of their voters, and purchase the appropriate technology to serve those needs. And that's what you're seeing actually happen in the United States now, is this equipment, like mentioned in Larry's report, like mentioned in the Presidential Commission report, as this equipment ages. Places like LA County went and started at the starting point of, what do our voters expect? What do they need, and how should the system serve them? And you're actually seeing that in a variety of jurisdictions, applied in a variety of ways in America. And then the question of, how are we going to pay for that? Whether it's a lease, whether it's funding through the county, funding through the state. And so this is something that's a struggle for Americans, and I forget who mentioned this. I think it was Bill, but then it was brought up again. This idea of the flawed procurement process, to me, the greatest impetus for change and ways to address innovation, at least in American elections, are to have a more informed consumer, to have a more informed election official that views themselves as an IT manager, and the implications of what that means in procuring these election systems. Because America is going to move away, I think, from monolithic voting systems, but instead to various components, and we're actually already seeing it, whether it's election night reporting systems, ballot on demand printers, e-poll books, whatever. Those are all voting technology at this point, right? It's not just about the tabulation system. And it's going to focus on 2 things, I think. Usability and accessibility, because those are the law, and then the security. And so the accessibility, that's required. Our law is clear about that and has to be part of the process, and then the security of those systems. And so as the EAC works to develop the next set of voting system standards, our focus is on how to best serve this kind of innovation and expectation of innovation from election officials across America.
Thank you. Zahid from the World Bank, I skipped you.
Could I just jump in?
Could I just? Sure. I skipped him once. I don't want to do it twice. That's, please.
Well, thanks very much for the invite. This is really timely discussion for us, because our 2016 annual flagship report is on digital technology. It's called Digital Dividends. And it basically looks at digital technology broadly and its impact on growth, jobs, and services. And on service delivery, I mean, one of the key issues that we look at is governance and accountability, and what role technology can play in that, and with elections being one subset of those issues. And here, I mean, if you expand to the developing countries, what you find is, in the last 25 years, while the number of democracies have doubled, and this is data from Oxford, the proportion of free and fair elections has halved. So there are a lot of paper democracies, a lot of areas where there's voting, but there's serious fraud that happens, which then I think opens up both the potential and the risks of this technology. There's clearly a lot of vested interest will have absolutely no interest in any process that increases the transparency of elections, right? So, and a dramatic example of what can happen is Brazil. I mean, the introduction of electronic voting in Brazil greatly enfranchised the poor, increased the number of accurate votes of the poor by 20%. This is a paper by Fujiwara. And that tremendously changed the type of candidates that got elected, the direction of public spending. So clearly that can be a big, big threat to any vested interest, right? So I would say that in those contexts, sort of a big bang rollout of electronic voting probably has a lot of risks because those vested interests will want to abuse that technology for their own gain, right? So in countries where there are strong institutions, I think the technology has tremendous potential, but where institutions are weak and unaccountable, I think we have to be very careful about whether this technology can get abused. I mean, the one caveat, even in countries with strong institutions, I think, is the issue of the digital divide. Because one of the things we want to make sure is that the technology doesn't disempower those who don't have digital access. And again, Brazil points to what can happen because when they used internet voting in Rio Grande do Sul, they found that 8%, it increased the number of voters by 8%, but those voters were disproportionately male and educated and higher income, right? So you want to look at the technology from, whether it's biased against the poor and the marginalized. But the big question for us is what do you do in those countries where the institutions are failing? I mean, can technology bypass these weak institutions and try to, sort of make change on the margin? And I think there's a lot of potential there for very simple, so rather than kind of the official electronic voting, working with governments that may not be interested, there's a lot of potential of sort of using cheap smartphone or mobile phone-based systems, working with civil society, and actually just trying to report fraud at elections. There are examples in Afghanistan where just taking photographs of the paper balloting process in individual polling stations then curtails the fraud in the aggregation process later on. There are examples in Mozambique where citizens and civil society can report election day violence, which is again a tool that is used to prevent voters from coming to the polling stations. So I think there's a lot of potential for international organizations working with civil society groups. And you don't need to have a big bang rollout of electronic voting, but again, using smartphones to try to bring in some degree of fairness in these election processes. So I think we are optimistic about sort of smartly used, cheaper technologies rather than kind of a big bang rollout, which has all these risks that were already mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you. Connie, I wanted to come back to you.
Thank you. I'd just like to comment on a few things both Matt and Larry said. I think, Matt, it just really makes me feel very positive when I hear that the EAC is really realizing the importance of looking at a whole range, that the election jurisdictions around the U.S. in 2006 were under a tremendous gun, really, of time. We just really, and I was an election official then, and I know how difficult it was to not have many choices and have to make decisions and not have the time to do the appropriate trainings or anything. It just was very rushed. Now, as you're saying, there's a different environment out there, and I also, with the reconstituted EAC, I think there's a recognition that there was a lot of rigidity in the old standards and certification process that really needs to become, it was stymieing innovation, which is the last thing anyone wants. Everyone wants to move forward and to get new technology that reflects our lives. And I think, to pick up a few things that Larry said, certainly the cost analysis is incredibly complex, and I think it has to include all of those parameters of the different needs of the different, I think that would really help election officials realize that there's going to be segments in there, and also cost avoidance issues that really they can't figure out a way to quantify. So it would be very complex, but I think very helpful. But in what Paul said about a 19-month-old or any child now, you give them a book and they start doing this. Have you seen children do that with a book? You hand them a book and they do this. They're waiting for the next page. It's just a disconnect between what the expectations are going to be in the world. And I used the Maryland example, and we talked about the definition of electronic voting. because it is more distinct in the U.S. with the counting of ballots versus in much of the democracies in the world, including most of Europe, it's still not just hand voting, but hand counting. But I use that example for a couple of reasons. One, people's expectations have been for a decade to go into the polling place in Maryland and touch a screen, and now they're going to be doing what Jim said and trying to figure out where to mark. And it's absolutely evidence that people make mistakes when they do that, some of which are picked up by the counting equipment and some of which are not. And also, Maryland's decision, I think we were not being insulting of Maryland at all. It was a recognition that they are leasing equipment because there's really nothing out there to buy right now. And I think that's an important point in the paper, to say that they're doing this process for a lot of political reasons and a lot of other reasons and a lot of equipment that's aging reasons, but not to make a permanent decision that's would even cost more money, sort of an interim decision. And I think that's the sort of the key word here, that some jurisdictions in the United States and around the world are trying to do some creative approaches. But it's wide open right now. But the expectations of the electorate, these 19-month-olds or the 7-year-olds or Matt's kids, they're going to be 18, and they're not going to want to be seeing an oval on a piece of paper. It's just not going to make any sense to them.
If I could just say one really quick thing in response to that is my sense is that we're not going to have an either or choice in the future, that there really does seem to, and LA County is a great example of this, it really does seem like in a lot of places the move is going to be towards some kind of system where you have an interface that then prints out a ballot that then is scanned. And to me, in the US, that seems like the future for polling place voting.
Well, that seems to be the direction it's going in right now. But then we've got the Utah example, which I think is fascinating, and people are going to expect that too.
Adam, you've been patiently waiting. I had planned to bring you in on the discussion of security, so I'm going to recognize you, but I also want you to touch a little bit on an issue. I mean, you have been responsible for advising on election systems, and so when people say, "But are they secure?" How do you? What's your answer? How do you respond to that?
Thank you so much. That was an answer to a question that I wasn't expecting to provide, but I'm happy to dive in there.
That's my role, to do the unexpected.
I know, and so I mean, we supported an effort and a research effort called the EDE VIV report, which basically looks at end-to-end verifiable voting technology. Knowing that in the U.S. There is not consensus clearly amongst the computer science community, the academic community, the elections community, that nationally we're ready to move forward on internet voting, where cast ballots are being returned online and a live election. The report was promoted, quite frankly, for the purposes of trying to understand what's going to happen 5, 10, 15 years down the road, when examples of what Paul and what Connie have said, where we're dealing with a generation that interacts with government almost entirely online. They're going to file their taxes online. They're paying parking tickets online. They're not going to want to stand in line to do anything. And so how do we contemplate moving towards a system that is secure and that allows that type of remote connectivity, even if it's just for a subset of the community, military and overseas voters, voters with disabilities, folks on travel. And so the goal of that report, which was released last year with the U.S. Vote Foundation, was basically to try to identify what security principles need to exist to promote a path forward. And so, I mean, to us, you need to have a couple of principles. You need to make sure that that voting has verifiability, that you know when you cast your vote that vote was counted in a way that you intended, that type of systems obviously needs to be auditable, and that the software associated with that probably should be made available publicly or for some review and and examination, and also it should be usable. I've heard stories of other countries where they have some form of internet voting, but it requires an emailed code, a mailed code, and 5 other types of verification. It makes it very difficult even for smart people to cast a ballot. And so I recommend everyone, in addition to reading Larry's report and Connie's report and the PCA report, to sort of think through where we might go in the future to make sure that the public has greater trust in the security of the process. I'll tack in one thing that which was my other point just really quickly. To me, costs in the United States is the key thing that we need to think about moving forward, because it drives whether or not we have the technology to move forward. And I'm optimistic, certainly, of what Matt had said and Connie referenced, that the EAC is back and they're contemplating more flexible standards. The issue is, because of this decentralization process in the United States, and that funding for voting machines are generally these one-shot infusions, whether it's HAVA or whether a system basically goes down or is decertified close to elections, people do not have the luxury in the United States of planning and contemplating what type of system they want to move to next. Virginia decertified about 25% of its voting systems, a win-vote system, about 9 months or so ago. And those jurisdictions that use those systems were left scrambling and trying to figure out how to backstop and create a voting system in time for 2016 to make sure that their voters had the ability to cast a ballot. This comes down to supporting funding for elections in a more direct and conscious way, going to state legislatures, going to appropriators at the local level, and trying to identify mechanisms of which people can say, listen, we can't do this the old way of only buying an entire set of voting machines for a jurisdiction in one shot. And so we've supported, through our grant making, an educational effort for the NCSL to meet with both election officials and state legislatures in various states to say, listen, you need to get ahead of the curve on the funding elements around voting, because we won't see the technology. Even some of these new and exciting startup companies that are coming into the space won't be able to survive unless there is a regular and constant stream of funding to support systems so that we don't have the meltdown or decertification. And so if there's one thing I would push, the security is something that we know needs to happen and we have to push long term, whether it's electronic voting or the some sort of internet voting far into the future. But I really think that we need to think consciously now about how we support additional funding at the state and local level for elections, because that drives so much of the market and will determine whether or not we have better systems or worse systems. So
thank you.
Thank you for
Adam.
My double answer on that.
I want to, as we move into where do we go in the future, which Rachel is gonna moderate a little bit, but I want to, funding is going to be a critical part of that discussion. But I want to ask Antonio a little bit the same question I asked Adam, which is, what do you, as the CEO of a company that has to explain the issue of security over and over again, how do you talk about security and electronic voting?
Great, and I'm going to do a little bit like Adam, and let me make a 20-second comment on cost. Something we tell every one of our customers around the world, doesn't matter if it's a tiny county in the US or if it's the Philippines or Brazil, both of which are customers, is what is your cost per voter per election. And it doesn't matter if this country or this jurisdiction is running it on pen and paper, which many are, or if they're running it with the latest technology, they will have a cost per voter per election. And we will be able to determine it, and in 100% of our sales in the past 12 years, we have been able to reduce the cost per voter per election. Always. And especially when it's a paper-based system. Right now, we're about to sign a project in Italy where cost per voter per election is 15 euros. Which, by the way, is similar to cost per voter per election here in the United States in most jurisdictions, which is around the $10 to $15. Whereas in the Philippines, we're doing $4 per voter per election. So, I mean, that's the key number, and I'm convinced, actually, that it will be a big driver for adoption of technology because of the efficiencies. Going to security, I think, of course, security is the most important thing when you're designing a voting system. We were a security company that then went into voting. And something that is lost in the noise, and I think there are two debates around security that shamefully are not very clear, especially when it comes to media, and we all know how in media, things get to be oversimplified and turn into quick sound bites and not having an in-depth analysis. But one thing is all of those that criticize security and technology but have no idea of what the real problems are when running an election. This is something that doesn't happen here because everyone here knows ballot stuffing, throwing, ballot boxes in the river, or, the problems with, postal voting, or, the different challenges in counties and, people that don't want to spend the entire night until 3 a.m. in the morning counting ballots and are tired and make mistakes. So when you move from that to use of good technology, you increase security in a very significant way. The second one, and it applies to most solutions, or most technology solutions around voting, has to do with this kind of general knowledge that any system can be hacked, right? And we see it on the news every day, and now the Apple phone was already hacked by, some third party, and, the Pentagon website was hacked, and, and everything's hacked. Bank of America, it doesn't matter. And because of this, then people think that the election could be hacked. But the truth is that when you have an election system, the election system has a very, very different way of working. And that very different way of working is that it only has to be live for 10 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, 8 hours. That's it. It's a very, very small, finite amount of time. And when you have to protect a system for a very small for a very small period of time, it is actually extremely easy to protect. Because, again, security is three things: money, computational power to breach the security, time, and the security mechanisms that you are going to have to violate. So those are the three variables. When time is limited, you can make the security difficult enough that you would need basically unlimited resources to be able to breach it. And that's a core principle behind all of the security of the systems that we develop. So security for election technology can be made near perfect. And I think, that's much better than any alternative.
Thank you. Rachel, I'm going to hand it over to you to bring the conversation towards the future. There are a number of name cards up, which we have written down here, and Rachel will bring everybody in.
Great. So thank you. So beyond identifying sort of the good and the bad and what this technology can do, what is a difficulty, I think what we tried to do in our research and what Connie did in her paper was to say, okay, what's next? How do we identify the policies and the practices that allow the good to shine and overcome the obstacles? And one of the things that became very clear is that independent third parties are a really important part of this process. And in some cases, it's international institutions, be that the UN or the OAS. And in some cases, that's civil society. So Pat, I know that you have your placard up and perhaps wanted to say something else, but I am also going to call upon you to ask you a little bit about the role of civil society. For a long time, international institutions have played an active role in elections, but now we're seeing civil society organizations play a much more intricate role. I know Open Society Foundation has also done this in elections, and so I would love to hear a little bit about how you see that role progressing as technology becomes more integrated into the electoral process.
So I think I'll do what politicians do, and that is answer the question by saying what I wanted to say, which is pretty close to what you're bringing up, Rachel. I mean, the challenge and what I think is really important about this conversation is that we're really talking about multiple topics. We're not talking about one thing. I mean, on the one hand, we're talking about technologies. On the other hand, we're talking about principles. On technologies, we're also talking about different things. I mean, I'd like to talk about looking to the future. How do we take blockchain technology that allows Bitcoin transactions around the world, marry into electoral technologies and allow people to vote over something like this, a smartphone, with a little more confidence and so on. That may be way in the future, but that's part of the conversation. Or talking about how Facebook and Instagram and YouTube play such a role in bringing forward people in the conversation that allows them to participate in elections and governance. That's part of the technique conversation. But I think, I learned a long time ago that when Kevin Casazamora is in the room, I don't really need to be here. Because I think, Kevin, you reminded us that principle is what this is about. We can't just talk about technique. I mean, we love to start conversations about the techniques, but the principles are what this is all about. And there's a very delicate balance here between the efficiencies and public trust in discharging what's a fundamental aspect of governments. And even more than that, it's fundamental to the relationship between citizens and their government. And I think in there, where there's some imbalance, let's have the imbalance favor building public trust. Let the technologies and the techniques come along in a way that match the trust building exercises. And if I will, I think the one part of Connie's paper, which I love, and Connie, whether we're in California or Yemen together, you always contribute a lot. But part of the paper, I think, that could be, yes, 18 years ago, that could be built up more is how to build up public trust. And some of these have to do with, you're going to introduce technology, Kevin said it, you have to do it, roll it out over time. Antonio said it as well. You have to also allow the public to understand and see into this technology, including the electoral competitors. So you need, as they've done in Belgium and other places, colleges of independent experts that look at things and can talk about the type of technology, how it's running and what it's doing. You need open data, because if you don't really know what's going on in the election and how the voter list has been compiled and what it is, or how the balloting has been done electronically or not over the course of the day, and how the transmission has taken place and whether you can trust it. If you don't really have access to that data, you're not going to trust the outcome, whether it comes in 2 hours or 4 days. So I do think that the role, not just of civil society, but the role of government and thinking what are the means of creating these windows of transparency to build the public trust so there's a sense that these processes are accountable. That's really where we have to look. And you can look at it in 6, 7, 8 different ways. I won't elaborate because I've used up my 2 minutes.
Great, that was really helpful. Mark, I think I'm going to pivot to you and sort of say, what role, I think Pat did a great job pulling out the role of civil society in this. What role can international institutions play, such as the UN, in establishing that public trust and sort of being that independent voice, not just validating at the end, but being part of the process of helping to determine which type of technology, the procurement process, the implementation and education process? What role do international institutions play in that can help support that public trust?
Thanks, Rachel. I mean, I think, look, everybody's, in a sense, although at one level you could see this conversation as representing two very extreme views of technology as no substitute for an absence of trust at one end, and technology can solve that at the other. But in fact, I think, as Pat has just described, there is much more of a common ground really in the middle, where we're more saying the same thing than it seems, because what I think we're all really saying is appropriately used and transparently used technology can build and contribute to trust. So coming from that to the role of the international organizations, I mean, I actually started the Democracy, Elections, Good Governance program at UNDP, and it just exploded during my time as administrator. I came back to the issue 10 years later after time on the political side of the UN and in the UK government, and was actually dismayed to find that child I'd left behind had unfortunately run into a slightly ugly adolescence because the quality of elections around the world was deteriorating. It's been said this morning, you just have to look at the Freedom House statistics or others. More elections, lower quality is, the basic global discovery, so that the repertoire of things we were doing that the international organizations were supporting, from training to observers, were not fixing the problem. They were insufficient given a general deterioration of public trust in elections. So it's become incredibly important to find ways to apply technology that reinforces trust. And I don't think it's a linear thing. I don't think you get trust first, then you put in technology. The two go together. And, we didn't trust banks, but actually the introduction of online banking has, if anything, improved our trust in banks. And so I think in the same way, we've got to look at technology as that support. Now, hence to the international organizations, my own view is they're useful, but they're just useful as part of a broader civil society. An IFIS, if an IFIS or an NDI, works with governments to help them see the palette of technology options they have and helps them choose between them around a solid public procurement process, that's as important as UNDP or OAS doing it. They're all doing it, all the better. But at the moment, to be honest, some of the democracy experts in country are not great champions of this. They are often champions of the status quo, and I say that as much about my old organization, UNDP, as others. So I think there is a real obligation on this group of election experts to themselves become comfortable with the technology and better presenters of it and its options to the governments where they are working. Let me stop there.
Great, thanks so much. Jim Dixon, I know you wanted to jump back in here.
Yes. Well, first, say they're for it when they're not. That's just the reality. And I do think it is that the way you fix something is by talking about it. And I mentioned peaceful transference of power because that's the issue. To say we need public trust, that means different things to everybody. It's whether or not you're going to give up power, whether or not you're going to let the voters decide who runs things. And I think we need to use language like that. I want to make one other point going back to cost. Cost is not just the cost of the equipment. Cost is all of the people who have to work to make the election happen. Cost is the talent and training of those people. I commend the Brennan Center for trying to produce a cost estimate. I'm not an economist, but it seems to me it ought to be possible to get business schools to look at past elections. Don't try to predict future costs. Let's just look at past elections and get down factually what it costs here or there to run last year's election and the election in the past. Let's get that data long, because we can't project future costs until we have the historic data.
Great, thank you so much. David Gardner, you wanted to jump in here.
Sure, thanks. Thanks for a great report. I just wanted to make 2 points. One, highlighting, as you do in the report, the enormous potential of technology to unleash greater participation. But two, I think a weakness, which you again highlight in your recommendation, which is confidence in technology, I don't think is a technical problem. I think it is in and of itself a governance challenge. So let me just highlight those briefly. So first of all, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, especially in the United States. You highlight in the beginning of the report, most countries have universal voter registration. We do not here in the United States, except in Oregon and California. That would be an enormous step forward, just as a more modest step forward is online registration, which is taking off. So that's low-hanging fruit. On the other hand, once you get into not just electronic voting, but online voting, then I think there are a series of technical challenges, but more importantly, there are a series of governance challenges. Already it's been highlighted that we in the United States have a very unique, somewhat odd system of decentralizing to county governments. It hasn't been highlighted as much that it's decentralized to partisan county officials. So, and you do highlight in the recommendations that we need independent oversight of elections. So in this country, in all countries. And secondly, to go back to Rachel's earlier point, I think you need to pair that with sort of grassroots monitoring, the effort toward wiki monitoring, Participedia, which has taken place in this country and as far out as Kenya. I think pairing the independence and sort of grassroots oversight may go farther to build confidence than purely technical fixes alone.
Great, thanks so much. Pam Smith, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for the report, and thanks for having this convening to launch it. I think it's great. So many things to talk about. Just a footnote here, there's a comprehensive cost study being conducted right now as we speak in California with nearly all of the counties participating at great levels of detail. And it's almost complete. It's being funded by Irvine. So hold your breath, election geeks. It's on its way. I just wanted to say that whatever election technology you use, whatever technology of any kind in elections should be reliable, and they need to produce reliable evidence that the outcome was correct or be able to correct the outcome if it wasn't. And I was really glad to see mention of audits in the report. I think technology by itself is neither good nor bad. It's how it gets implemented that matters. And if we can agree on a sort of a baseline of reliability and access beneath which we refuse to sink, then I think we have the opportunity to build from there. Acceptance from skeptics about technology is attained by demonstrating to the public's satisfaction the reliability of the system. And I also wanted to add that there's been this quiet revolution over the past half decade or more of advocates and election officials, security specialists, accessibility, usability experts, all working together towards common goals in making elections better. There are mathematicians and statisticians working on how to make better checking of election outcomes for higher level of confidence. There are people working with design teams to make better voting system designs than we've ever had before. Advocates from accessibility groups met with usability and security folks and with election officials to come up with ways to improve accessible remote vote by mail in a way that everyone could agree on, because we're seeing so much expansion of vote by mail, and that takes away access if it's not done right. So I think, we study elections together. We dive deep into them. We look at costs. We look at what drive the costs, and we try to leave no stone unturned on participation. And I feel like when we do that, and when we find the common ground from which to work outward, we can do so much good in the world. That outreach has gone both ways, elections officials to advocates and vice versa. And, I think that that's something, there is a digital divide even among election jurisdictions too. A retiring election official from Florida was just interviewed, and he talked about how he would have been able to make a particular change that was recently legislated in his state in a matter of weeks, but other jurisdictions in the state didn't have that capability. And Kim Brace has been doing this a lot longer than I have, but in tracking voting systems in use around the country, when we first did a map of those voting systems at our organization in 2004, there were jurisdictions that didn't have an online presence at all, and we were lucky if they had a fax number. and that's completely changed over the past decade plus. So that's a good thing. But back then, some did have the technology and some didn't. So I think that's something we deal with not just internationally, not just in other countries, but also even here in the States, from one jurisdiction to another. Thanks.
And I think you bring up a great point that we really tried to start this whole project with the question, which is what makes a legitimate election, what makes a credible and legitimate election, and then tried to, once we sort of teased out some of the answers to that, tried to look at how technology could be sort of the means to an end, and that end being the answer to that question. So David Gender, I'd love to bring you in now.
I just wanted to go back to the internet voting in the United States. I'm not against internet voting, and I think things for political party primaries, like just happened, are good uses. One of the reasons is parties are under no obligation to even open up voting to anyone, and so it's a little less important. But for general elections, I do have concerns. We use the reference for credit cards or paying your taxes online. One difference is if you pay your credit card online and you're hacked, it doesn't hurt me. But if your vote is compromised, even if I vote traditional means, it still damages the integrity of my election, not knowing if my candidate legitimately won or not, even if I choose not to vote on the internet. You know, I know it's been done successfully in Estonia, for example. We were talking about, you know, the short 8-hour period, the 24-hour period. One other issue that comes up with internet voting is the secrecy of the ballot. It's very easy to sell your vote because I could do it on a laptop and show everyone. Not so much an issue in the United States, but it's something that could happen again. The way Estonia gets around it very cleverly is letting people vote as many times as they like with only their last vote counting, which effectively destroys the incentive for someone to buy your vote. But that does require internet voting to be open for more than one day. It does require internet voting to be open to weeks and weeks. And Estonia has been hacked. They, not necessarily their voting system, but they are completely online. They've had their entire online government, their taxes, everything shut down for days at a time, which I think could definitely undermine the trust in elections overall. So I do think internet voting does have use, party primaries, overseas voters, military voters. But another thing, you know, if Estonia is going to get hacked, it's a small country that a lot of people haven't heard of. I'm sure if the United States went to a large online voting system anyway, every hacker in the world, including many very good ones, would also be trying to compromise that. So I would just want to say, I'm not against it. I think it has uses, but for the United States in a general election, I think it poses a lot of dangers.
Great, thanks so much. So we do want to get everyone involved. So I'm going to start getting a little more strict about the 2 minutes. Jason, do you want to jump in?
First of all, I'm thrilled that we're having this conversation, and it's hard to follow all the amazing contributions that have been made. I think, you know, one thing is I think about, Jim, your comment, Pat, your comment, Kevin, others have talked about building public trust. I think back to the 2006 Mexico elections where I was down there as an observer, and think about the preliminary electoral results that came in and showed the vote too close to call, and then over the course of a couple of days, originally AMLO was leading, and then Felipe Calderón started to lead afterwards, right? And there was a real question about the integrity of the voting process because they had to count the 300 actas around the country, and those were paper ballots. They had to physically go in there. Some of those ballots were illegible, and so it took a process of a couple of days. And AMLO had protests in the Zocalo for days on end, and this went all the way to the Supreme Court. And so you think if this was done using electronic voting, that those actas that were illegible to many of the voting authorities, how some of the lack of, I think, legitimacy in the eyes of AMLO's supporters could have, for President Calderón, could have been avoided 10 years ago. But another point is, you know, we're talking about public trust. I think something we haven't talked about right now, which is a phenomenon in democracies in the U.S., parts of Latin America, Brazil, parts of Europe, is a citizen disenchantment with the political elites and citizen disenchantment with what they feel is a lack of representation in democracy overall. And this is really, I think, one of the greatest challenges of our time is how do we rebuild that political trust, yes, in election day, but also in the overall democratic process as well. And how can electronic voting be used as a tool to help to build greater political trust in the process? And I think that's the question I really just want to throw out to the group to think about is, I think this is the actual process on election day is critical. We have to make sure that it's secure. We have to make sure that it's verified. We have to make sure that it's inclusive. But how could what's the potential, Rachel, going to thinking to the future, what's the potential of electronic voting to rebuild that citizen trust in the political process itself, which is incredibly lacking, and I think one of the greatest challenges of our time right now.
Great, thanks so much, Jace. Bill, are you braving jumping back in here?
I'm breathing, yep. Okay. Let me first of all, this has been a fascinating conversation, and it's been going on at about 5 or 6 different levels on different topics. Pat mentioned open data. This is the first conversation on technology I've been sitting through that hasn't talked about the very real civil society political trust issue in many societies about proprietary machinery versus open source. And that's a debate that should be a chapter of this conversation. Secondly, I'm going to give a shout out to the Pew Center for some of their work, particularly as far as looking at the skill sets that we've got with election workers in this country. And one of the things that's coming up in this country is we are losing our paper skills because so much of this is digitized. So the longer we stay with paper, we're either going to have very old people doing repetitive tasks under a lot of stress, or we're going to have 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds who aren't used to counting stacks of paper. Those are the election workers, folks. And that skill set is being lost in the West, in the modern democracies. Not so much in other countries, but it's still going away, and that's something we've got to deal with. One issue for many transitional economies and transitional democracies is something that we tend to overlook in the West, and that is we don't assume electric power. In many of the elections that we have to deal with, electronic voting is nice, but it's fantasy. Batteries don't last that long. They don't have plugs in schools to recharge. The computers just get used up. So that's a factor that we've got to throw in here. Final point I'm going to make is everyone wants to get online and not inline. And how we get there is always a mystery. But I will tell you, in November, IFAS will sponsor its 12th or 14th U.S. election program. We will have a few hundred election administrators from around the world. They will get on buses. We will have worked all of this out with precinct officials and secretaries of state. They will see 5 different voting systems in 3 different jurisdictions within 50 miles. And then they will come up to me as an individuals and a group and say, you Americans are crazy. You absolutely crazy. How do you conduct a voter education campaign? How do you get the information out to the voters, particularly the poor, particularly the elderly, particularly people with disabilities, particularly people who travel, on what you've got to do in this particular system so as to get your vote cast? And that is a major, major issue in this wonderfully decentralized quilt we call the American election system. Thank you, Rachel.
And on that note, Bill, you mentioned Pew, so Sam, if you want to come into the conversation here.
I actually wanted to echo a point that David made, and that is that what happens on Election Day, performance on Election Day, is not an isolated event. So there are a chain of events dating months or even years into the past that had to occur for that voter to have a smooth time at her polls. And it dates back all the way. The first link of that chain is voter registration. And so if a voter shows up to her polls, whether or not the poll worker is checking her in on a giant stack of paper or a tab or a touchscreen device of some sort, if the voter roll is rife with duplicates, if it is rife with inaccuracies, if her address has been transposed accidentally when a election poll worker or an election official was typing her record into their system, then she's going to have problems anyways. And so it's mentioned briefly in the report, but I wanted to highlight it. Employing better technology throughout the election ecosystem, all the way back to voter registration, is going to improve performance on Election Day. The machines employed on Election Day can only be as accurate and as efficient as the data put into them. And that data starts with voter registration. So when we see states here in the US, there are now I think 32, counting DC as a state, 32 that have online voter registration. We're seeing states join together to share voter registration information so they know who is eligibly registered in their jurisdictions. That's the first process, and when we can get better election data into the voting machines, you're going to see more accuracy, you're going to see better speed, and you're going to see voters who have a higher sense of integrity in the system when they didn't have a problem just getting through the door to begin with. And I think that direct causal link between voter registration and performance on election day really cannot be understated.
Great, thank you. You know, early on in this process, we spoke to a bunch of election officials, and one of them said to me a bit tongue-in-cheek, election day is overrated. And I think he was really trying to emphasize all of the work and all of the processes that lead up to election day that you're mentioning that are so important to have it go smoothly. Tammy, do you want to jump in now?
I did. Actually, that's the perfect segue. Thank you for inviting me here today. I think that things that Sam mentioned were all items that the Presidential Commission on Election Administration that we included in our report for recommendations to make sure that the foundation that our elections are built upon are actually strong and valid. But some of the other things that we heard when we were having our hearings back in 2013, I look back at the report now, and we've actually made a lot of headway in the last 3 years. We now have an EAC, we have new standards, the next iteration is in the process of being written. But this is very, very timely because what is happening across our country now is that the HAVA equipment is being replaced. It's either just been replaced in some jurisdictions or it's about to be replaced within a very small window of time in the next couple of years. So if we miss this opportunity, then it's going to be another 10 years. Before, in most cases, before jurisdictions are going to be replacing their equipment, unless they're able to go to a more nimble model with a common data format and be able to purchase units. Sorry, I stole your thunder.
No,
I know, it's the IEEE P1622 shout out. So I think that it's I know, it's so geeky. But I think that it's really important to recognize that we do need to act quickly in order to take full advantage of this short window that we have.
Great, thank you so much. Secretary Carrero, just want to...
Yeah, thank you. Very briefly, just to say that in terms of the discussion related to trust, it is always important to remember that trust is built through public perception. And public perception is very much related to the way we carry out elections. And not only during the election day. Of course, election day is always important. Myself, I had the opportunity of organizing a presidential election after 2006, in 2012 back in Mexico, and perception is everything in terms of trust. In that sense, I would like to point out a few things. First, of course that technology is important, but technology is only one part of the election cycle. It's important, it's very relevant, but if we don't take into consideration other elements that are happening during the campaigns, it's going to be complicated to give a good answer in terms of how to use technology, particularly in countries, I'm referring to the Latin American region, in countries which trust is still a complicated matter. In that sense, I guess that we will have to pay more attention to the whole picture, not only to the use of technology, but also to electoral integrity, which has already been mentioned by Kevin and Ruben. In that sense, I would say that political context is extremely relevant. And of course, the quality of elections. We're having more elections in the region, but that doesn't mean necessarily that elections are being better in a way. I mean, we have more elections, I think we have more democracy in Latin America, in the continent, but that doesn't mean necessarily that the quality of elections or the use of technology is improving that situation. And I would like to point out again, and just to put it forward, because I would say that for research can be very important. And I think that Kevin could join me in this one because he was in my post before and he knows the drill. The reports of the electoral observation missions are very important, are very relevant, because we deploy a whole team of international observers in each election. So for the industry, for international organizations, to have a look to these reports, I would say that could be very relevant in terms of knowing exactly what's going on in each country, and then we can perhaps draw some conclusions. Just finally to say that we have to gather more information to draw better conclusions. And that's something that we can work together. And of course, the OAS would be happy to participate into that task.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Anne, we haven't heard from you yet.
Well, thank you for commissioning this report and research, and it was a very good read, and I'm glad we're having this event here. My first point I want to make in the technology or information and communication technology for development community, I think there's a vast recognition and belief in the philosophy that technology is an amplifier. And if you guys have probably heard this before, and you know, if the elections are open, transparent, and fair, and the processes around it are fair, the technology will amplify it. If it's not, it will not. So that's a perspective I'd urge everybody to think of when they think of using technology. The second thing is, whether we like it or not, as has been alluded by many people here, everybody would want very soon, in the very near future, everybody would be voting online. And they would be, once they go and cast their vote online, they will be probably using Facebook to tell people that they've voted online, and so on and so forth. So as we make recommendations and studies of technology, electronic voting technologies, we should think hard and perhaps leapfrog the research from electronic voting systems, which in the report it says, you know, in the Netherlands costed around $9 to $10 potentially to replace voting technology, to what's in online voting you're seeing at $4 in some places. What can be done, and how can we fund research and innovation to address some of the challenges, such as David mentioned, in online voting. The last thing I'd like to say is, Zahid had a really good point in that there's more, and some others mentioned it as well, there's more to technology in elections than actually the casting the ballot. And there are some cheap and very innovative ways in which technology can be used for monitoring elections. And I'd urge for the community to also perhaps commission some research around that, because that could surely help the process. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to do one last question, but before I do that, Greg, do you?
Thank you, Rachel, and thanks for the Atlantic Council for convening this imperative discussion and inviting me to participate. Connie, thank you for a very important piece of work. It's obviously a catalyst for a great conversation, and it's interesting. Mr. Merlot earlier talked about the variety of topics here and the notion of principles in technology. And the one thing I want to throw out here, at the risk of invoking a famous politician, I have a radical idea. And the radical idea is to recognize that the technology that underlies our electoral infrastructure is critical. It really is critical democracy infrastructure. And if that's true, and we all believe that, then there's a suggestion that a certain portion of that technology ought to be publicly owned. And that does not, as some people would suggest, intend to destroy an industry that's vital to the delivery of that stuff. In fact, for those of us who spent decades being partially to blame for the commercialization of the internet, we can tell you that quite the opposite is true. That open source technology can actually reinvent and recatalyze an imperative industry to deliver, deploy, service, and support it. But it has a dramatic impact on the cost factor too. The whole notion of open source is to achieve this thing called the VAST mandate, the verifiable, accuracy, security, and transparency in process. So it may come as no surprise that when I looked at this report, Connie, the thing that struck us was that in thinking forward, there was no discussion, not even nary a footnote, about the notion of alternative models of ownership, availability of technology, etc. The open source cloud, if you will, has been darkening the doorstep of a lot of areas of technology, and it continues to do so. I insist that it is actually a catalyst for rejuvenation. I want to point out that I'm not just speaking from one little corner here in the Silicon Valley. There's actually 7 projects right now, just 7 of actually more than that I'd like to mention that ought to be considered. There's COASCA, there's Prime 3, there's Scantegrity, there's the StarVote project out of Rice University in Travis County, there's the LA County's work on VSAP. San Francisco last November passed a resolution. They're going the direction of building an open source-based system. And of course, there's the work at the Trust the Vote project. I just encourage this enormous, amazing brain trust here to think about this concept of critical democracy infrastructure and whether or not the software technology layer of this, which is so vital to achieving that vast mandate ought not to be a public asset and allow the commercial industry to reinvent itself. I'll just real quickly point out Linux, an operating system that drives 95% of the world's web servers. IBM recognized that they didn't need to sell OS/2, they could sell Linux. And then you have this $1 billion company called Red Hat, who rose up out of nowhere to provide enterprise-grade support to Linux. That's just one example of about 8 or 9 technologies that drive the internet today. We believe that the world democracy deserves that public ownership of a critical democracy infrastructure, and let that industry recatalyze itself around it.
Great, thank you. I'm sure that many of you found something that you wish we could elaborate on, and I'm sure that with all of the brain power in the room, we could have written a much, much longer report.
And I will also say some of these were in the initial drafts and ended up on the cutting room floor because of time. You know, there's only so much you could put in there, and I had references to the Travis County and LA County and others, and also other references similar. But at some point, it has to be readable and not too long. So that ended up on the cutting room floor.
So I think, Kevin, I will drag you into this conversation at the very end there, which is one last question, which is I think we've heard a lot about the cost and questions about cost and how expensive this is and how that is prohibitive. And so the last question I'd like to throw out is about financing this and who finances this. And so, Kevin, actually, perhaps this is a great question for you, given that maybe the OAS could finance this. But I do wonder who we turn to for this.
Such a rich institution.
I think I'm gonna do a Pat Merlot. I'm gonna ask the question. I mean, I'm gonna answer the question I would have liked to be asked, but particularly, you know, when it comes to the funding, I mean, I have no answer to that one. I mean, it's a thorny issue, and I think it's been great that some of the folks here have recognized how central the issue of cost is to all this. But you know, I just wanted to draw your attention to something that has struck me about this discussion, which is that, you know, we've been talking almost exclusively about e-voting, and the title of the report mentions the technology in elections, which is, you know, a much broader issue. You know, there are many alternative uses of technology in electoral processes, and I guess if we go into this discussion, we should do it with some sense of priority, and ask ourselves where injecting technology into the electoral process can make the greatest difference. I mean, otherwise we risk putting the cart before the horses. And that's something actually that you see time and again in this kind of discussion. You know that whenever we talk about technology, it's kind of a solutions in the lookout for problems, right? And it struck me in particular the fact that when we talk about the U.S. And what's happening with electoral processes in this country, we're talking about e-voting. Shouldn't we? And this is, you know, my impression from the outside in looking at the U.S. election. I mean, shouldn't we talking about leveraging technology to solve the enormous problems of voter registration that this country has? And there, you know, David stole my thunder. Shouldn't we be talking more in the light of the enormous calamity that the campaign finance system has become in this country? Shouldn't we be talking about uses of technology to increase campaign finance transparency to the extent that is legally possible? You know, and I'm not naive. You know, I know there are many reasons why these two issues in particular are not put in the front burner. But I'm just trying to remind ourselves that that we have to be careful with how we frame this discussion. Because if we focus it entirely on e-voting, if we make technology in elections equivalent to e-voting, we might be embracing the wrong priorities. And we might be even inadvertently, I'm sure, playing a political game that's not necessarily to the benefit of democracy.
Thank you, Kevin. I think that's an interesting point. But we did sort of try and focus on one central piece of this, because I think that you're absolutely right that there's so many components of the electoral process that we could bring technology into. I mean, we heard from a lot of people that a free and open press was an important piece of an election, and of course, technology has a major role to play in that. And so I think that this paper and our research really did try and focus in on one component of it, lest we sort of venture down that rabbit hole. But it is an excellent point that there's so many pieces of this. Matt, I will give the last comment to you.
Well, that is a huge mistake. But I appreciate it, thank you. And as the son of a teacher, I'm actually going to assign homework to everyone in this room, if that's okay. You all gave us homework coming in, and that is, and it kind of ties in, I think, with several of the comments, including this idea behind international standards or looking at standard setting. The EAC is trying to lead the way in writing the next set of voting system standards, at least to be applied to some systems here in America, by having a public working group process that is focused completely on the election process. And so to the point that Kevin just made, we're trying to analyze not just where we could just throw technology in, but in fact where the voters and election officials want to use technology to inform the process. So with that said, what I'd encourage all of you to do is go to eac.gov, sign up for the public working groups that are focused on writing this next set of standards, and help inform the process with your perspectives, because it's open to anybody. We want input from everyone. We've had tremendous participation from election officials, advocacy groups, computer scientists, and in particular for the uber geeks in the room, the EAC is working with our partners at NIST to write a common data format for election systems that would help inform not just voting systems, but voter registration systems, as well as auditing systems on the back end, so that these systems can actually talk to each other and provide a level of transparency and integration in that way. And so please, even if it's 5-10 minutes of your time a week, or your staff's time, even better, to get involved, go to eac.gov, sign up for the public working group, and help inform, I hope, what will be a set of standards that can at least help feed the rest of your work in other places, and tell us where we're getting it wrong as well, because we really have the goal of trying to enable innovation, to address the concerns that Connie and the PCA shared in their reports about the standard setting process and the EAC certification process hurting innovation instead of embracing it. So I hope that's a good closing for you.
Well, not quite, because I am going to push you a little bit more on the finance issue, which is, we've heard from so many people that the cost question has remained an obstacle, and so sort of given the role that you have in this, who pays for this?
Well, yeah, depends what this is, right? Because there's a variety of theirs there, as in registration, improvements to the election systems. The reality is it's unlikely that the federal government's going to pay, and so what the EAC is focused on, working with folks like NCSL, working with folks, county and state election officials, is one, to inform the funders about the challenges and what they need to do, and then help break down where cost savings can be found. So if you look at what Colorado has recently done with their voting system, I would encourage all of you to go and look at Colorado's approach, which is one that combines a variety of ways, including using off-the-shelf products, and software as a service model to save some money. And there was a recent report that Pew put out talking about the cost savings and the efficiencies found for voters in this Colorado model. And so the EAC's job in this is to share that information and help educate not just the election officials but the funders so that they can take a more analytical approach. I mean, what we have is data and best practices to share to help do that. And I think that's an appropriate role for us.
All right, well, thank you very much. I do appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for participating today. I think what we heard sort of time and again was that public trust means being more inclusive and having a transparent and inclusive process. And I think that this meeting was sort of a great first step in bringing together people from all different sectors. We had international organizations, NGOs, companies, journalists, election officials here today. So I really appreciate the participation from across industries. You've been incredibly useful. A lot of you have been very supportive of this project from the beginning, and I think it's a sign that this is an important moment to talk about this, not only because of these upcoming elections, of course, in the United States and in other countries, but as Peter said at the beginning, we are at a unique moment to influence an inevitable disruption. So we at the Atlantic Council look forward to continuing our involvement, very appreciative for the input of so many of you. Thank you to Connie for such a great report. In particular, thanks to Antonio and Mark, who asked to have a real debate on this subject, and we have found them to be really open and transparent about their business and the role of technology in the future and in elections. Thank you so much. We really enjoyed having you this morning. Thank you all for coming.